Hi, everyone. So, thank you for the intro and excited to be here. Let's talk about the age. How do we interview now that we have all the GPTs available? But let's start with a little bit of history. In 2018, interviews are never fun, but in 2018, we got to a point where interviews become insane. The candidates were asked to build cloud infrastructure, Kubernetes, deploy databases, deploy application, do a bunch of insane stuff for days, sometimes even more than a week, like it's a freelance project, and this was just an interview. And the thing that, in addition to this being frustrating and long, this also had like this one main flood. The problem is that if you were able to find a good a tutorial, like a how-to tutorial or like something like this, you probably would nail this interview pretty fast. So this wasn't really testing any kind of skill, but mainly your ability to Google and find good tutorials. And this is why we've created this kind of an idea of escape box, and I posted a Medium post about it if you want to read, back in 2018, that tries to kind of simulate an escape room, but in a Linux environment or in a Linux box. What I tried to achieve is giving tasks, but without an ability to actually Google them relatively easy. So, for example, you can see how it starts. You will get an email with this address, and it says like, "Welcome to your escape box. Think of it as an escape room and a technical interview in one. If you do everything right, you get a file, and this is actually your employment proposal that is decrypted with the key that you got in an email," which is, we thought this is a cool idea. And then I'm saying, log into the server. This is step one, and I don't explain how. And if someone would try to SSH, he will fail. But if someone will try to kind of telnet to the port or netcat to the port, he will see that actually the SSH is not there, and he should scan what ports are available. And then one of the ports would say that you should do a post request with your email to actually get a way to sign in. So this was kind of the idea of this exam, to try and give tasks, but that are not very searchable. And for a while, this was really, really good. But now, in last year, I'm starting to see kind of new kind of challenges. And I'll share with you a couple of examples. One example, I was interviewing a person in this dark room, and I'll explain why the dark room matters in a second. But I was interviewing this person, and I was asking him one of my favorite questions during the interviews, which talks about like Linux troubleshooting, or the machine is slow, how do you figure out what the problem? And usually it goes into high level things like, oh, it's probably CPU, memory, disk, or network. But each of those is a rabbit hole, or like a Pandora box. It has a lot of different questions inside that you can ask. And at some point you get into more complex stuff, like explain how load average works, or explain how do you do strace to understand system call, to understand why the CPU is utilized, and things become complex the more you ask like why, or what do you do, or and this is a loop that is endless. But with this candidate, we were going to insane depth. Like at some point he was he was talking about CPU flame graphs, which is rare, I can tell you. This never happened during the interview. But the interesting thing, that every time I asked the question, the room and the person face lighten up, literally, because he was switching from the Zoom page to probably what I assume was ChatGPT page to ask the question, or to get the answers. And this was really, really annoying. And the second case that I had, I was interviewing a candidate, again over Zoom, and we were talking about like it was a Kubernetes interview, and I was asking this person obvious stuff to explain, but usually the obvious stuff are the hardest to explain. So I was asking him, when you create a Kubernetes service, can you explain what actually happens? and there are depths to it, right? So the way this person responded, it was like this. He repeated my question very slowly. What happens when you create a Kubernetes server? Then he made a thinking face for a second. Then we had this like awkward silence of 3 to 5 seconds, and then suddenly he had all the right answers. Like there's a parsing on the client side, there's a admission webhook, there's validating webhooks, there's etcd persistence, there's API, like everything, endpoint and service controllers, and just perfect answers with all the parts. And then I said, okay, well, can you explain endpoint, and can you explain a scenario where I would have, let's say, 3 pods and let's say 2 endpoints? And again, he said, explain why there can be 3 pods and 2 endpoints. Did a thinking phase, waited for a couple of seconds, and boom, all the right answers. Mismatched labels, misconfigured ports, podding, terminating, or all other stuff. Now, I've been, as you can see, judging by my haircut, I've been interviewing for a while. I know how people that are trying to remember stuff usually answer, and they start answering, they remember one additional thing, and then one more, and it's gradually exposed. And at the end, I don't expect candidates to know everything right away all the time. I just expect them to be honest and say what they know and what they don't know. And this is no longer possible or easy with ChatGPT. So hi everyone, I'm Lev, I'm CTO at TerraSky. And TerraSky is a global solution integrator. We are premier partners of AWS, Google, and strategic partner of Microsoft. We're a hyper-specialized partner of HashiCorp. And we help our customers figure out their DevOps, platform engineering, and infrastructure challenges. And sometimes we help them also interview their candidates. So going back to our subject, how do we test people when they use GPT and GPT knows pretty much everything? Well, I want to ask something that LLM doesn't know, but what LLM don't know that is relevant to DevOps. And I had an idea of creating my own cloud or cloud simulator and building a Terraform provider for this cloud. So this way I could actually interview people, and probably ChatGPT wouldn't know much about my own cloud with my own provider with my own syntax. So we're making interviews great again, and kind of a basic, not very complicated diagram of the components that we have. We have the TS Cloud, which is the simulator. I have the Terraform provider and the Terraform code that the candidate has to write, and I have the CLI. That is operating with the cloud, because I didn't build the whole web interface like AWS. So let's see a demo to see how that seems from the candidate perspective. I'm using the best terminal there is, and I'm running a demo magic, so I won't do mistypes. So first we start with just the task itself. And I can send it in an email or just show it like this, but this is kind of the challenge. Welcome to the challenge. This is a hands-on technical assignment for Terra Cloud. This is similar to AWS, but it's a bit different. We want to, there will be documentation and access to credentials that I'm saying that I will provide. And I will ask the candidates to create a couple of components. And basically what I'm saying is, here's your task. Create a VPC for QA environment with Terraform code. Name of the VPC should be QA-env. The API of the Terra Cloud is available at localhost. Obviously, it should be available somewhere remotely when the interview is actually happening, so he won't be able to, so the candidate won't be able to kind of just see the code, and good luck. And I'm giving some references to documentation that we have of the cloud, of the CLI, of the index, so kind of let's see what it looks like. And here I'm intentionally adding more information that is needed to make it overwhelming, because this is how it happens. You're under stress, you're trying to build something, and there's too much documentation, and you have to know what you're reading. So there's a bunch of very interesting introduction that people should know how to skip. There's authentication mechanisms and environment variables and the resources that I can create. And I also briefly mentioning that I have an open API and the docs section where candidates can actually try things. So this is important because those important things are usually mentioned as a small, tiny thing in the documentation, and they're never very explicit. In addition, I'm also saying that there are regions, and not all regions have all the services, or kind of. And there's a note that says there's something very special about the VPC resource that we're about to create. Hopefully that the candidate will be focused enough to read it. And then there's again a bunch of very not interesting stuff about the roadmap that have nothing to do with the interview itself and the conclusion and all of this. Then we have the CLI. And the CLI is also great. I have a documentation that says we can run it, and we have all kind of flags like instance, and all of them have like subcommands like create and list and get. And I have it for all of the resources like VPC and subnet and so on. Now, there's obviously also outdated documentation because it doesn't contain one of the most convenient subcommands, that is tscli resources, which actually shows all the resources. But this is the expectation from the candidates to kind of try things and figure things as they go. And then we have the provider documentation itself with some example that they can copy and start working with them. So that's kind of the documentation. From here, let's see the Terraform file that we have, and it starts with requested provider. We have the provider that is TS Cloud, so should be easy. So let's write our Terraform VPC code. Okay, so we're adding TS Cloud VPC. That is test. The name should be QA as was requested. This is the CIDR block and the region, Terra East. Now I'm trying to plan it. It fails because there is no credentials. And I didn't provide it, even though I said I will provide it, because this is reality. This has happened. I do mistakes. I sometimes promise things that I don't always provide. And this is interesting to validate when, at what point the candidate will realize he has no access to those credentials and will actually contact me and say, hey, I think I don't have a credentials and I cannot find them. Because sometimes, and this is a good kind of way to understand if the person is actually, raising a flags or notifying when there's a problem fast enough. So let's define secret key and the ID, and let's run the plan, and we have our plan. Great. Let's do the apply. We're trying to apply it, and boom, we don't have the host URL that we also have to configure. Now, I could configure that in the Terraform file itself, but I obviously want to see the candidate don't put any sensitive stuff inside of the configuration. So this is also one of the validation that the candidates leverage environment variables. All right, so we're doing plan worked. Now let's do the apply, and this wasn't created for some reason. So what is the problem? There was an error creating VPC, and its E125 entity type in region Terra East is not available yet. It's coming soon in Q3 of 2025. And there's a reason for this. If we read the documentation, and I've mentioned this note, there's actually a note that says that for the VPC is currently only available in Terra Central because Terra Cloud is awesome and super advanced. So now let's change it to Terra Central and try to apply again. And it wasn't created again. Why? What happened this time? Okay, so this time I actually reached the maximum of entities. So this is probably some kind of limitation. Then we can try to figure out what we can do with the CLI. In the CLI, I have a couple of subcommands. One of them is the resources. And I see the list of my VPCs. At this point, hopefully, the candidate will contact me saying like, what can he do? And I can say, okay, you know what, maybe you have too many VPCs, just delete one of them. It's not important, they're not critical. So let's delete one of them, and sure, let's delete production, why not? So this was successfully deleted. We can see that it's removed. Let's try to apply it again. We cannot create it again. What happened this time? So this time we actually have a duplicate entity of QANF, which happens. It usually have a different name for AWS for the message, but duplicate IDs or duplicate names are common in different clouds. Great. So let's delete our QANF and create one of my own. And let's try again. And this time it was successfully created. So we have our VPC, and obviously this can continue, but this is kind of the preview of what is possible to achieve with this. Now, how does it work? I have the cloud simulator and the CLI, and this was pretty easy. As you can see, I'm using Cursor. I pretty auto-generated most of this code with the Cursor. This is my Python simulator. I can wrap it inside of some kind of container, and I can deploy it somewhere remotely, so the candidate won't be able to kind of reverse engineer it. But it's pretty straightforward. I have my credentials here because I don't need a true authentication mechanism, and I have the available region, and I'm validating that the region have to be in the right convention. I have the model for my resources, and then I have my errors that are actually built here, and I can build them as many as I want or as complex as I want. But you can see the Terra Central that I'm validating that VPC is only possible here, and I'm checking the maximum entities and so on. Then I have my TSCLI, which just a CLI. Obviously, this should be compiled. So again, the candidate won't be able to reverse engineer it. But so far, this is pretty straightforward. Then I needed to create a Terraform provider. And it maybe sounds complicated. It sounded complicated to me because I don't write too much Go or providers at all. But I remember that there was a code generator plus OpenAPI. So I said, awesome, I've read the article, and the article said that it's pretty easy. You just have OpenAPI spec, and then you generate this provider spec gen, and then you kind of configure the YAML file that says what you want to have in your Terraform provider, and then you run some command, and you have a provider. Sounded amazing. This is exactly what I wanted. So I want to show you a couple of like the experience that I have, and maybe this is kind of an ask for the doc team to make it a little better. So this is a workflow example to actually do the OpenAPI, and it sounds pretty straightforward. You initiate the project. This is for pet store provider creation, and everything should be great here. But the way it goes is like this: you run this command to scaffold the resource, then you get the structure of the files. Then you get the OpenAPI JSON from your server. You configure the YAML that says that this is your provider and this is the resource, and those are the methods that you want to be available, and the attributes and their aliases. You run this command to generate what you want to do, and this command to actually get the code. And this should be pretty straightforward. And I expected it to be, maybe this was too much of an expectation from my side, but I expected it to be right out of the box. But then this started. Start by deleting the contents of everything you scaffolded and paste this entire new code, which was surprising. But even more interesting thing is that the whole example here is actually static and not going to the real API. But luckily, there was this amazing video And thanks to Robin, which actually explains how do you build a provider if it's not auto-generated. So by mixing and matching stuff, I was able to kind of leverage my auto-generated code with the actual provider to actually make it work. But again, to the team that created the documentation, if you can add more realistic example with the real API calls, probably it would be great. And if it's open API, maybe you can add already the client embedded or bootstrap into this, also could be amazing. So let's see the provider, what the provider that I generated looked like, or what was missing for me. So first part, I had to add the configuration for host, for access, and for secret, just to be able to provide those configurations. And I also had to make sure it's available and accessible through environment variables. Then I had to bootstrap the client, REST client, so I can run those commands with my host and my secret and access ID from the provider. Then you actually add this client that you create here, so it will be available in data source and in the resources. And I actually added one resource for my provider that is new VPC. Once I did this, you have to remember that your provider, you have to have this configuration in your Terraform RC that is actually saying that most of your provider you will access directly, but this specific provider will be actually located here. And then it should correlate with the Terraform main TF where you're referencing this provider exactly by the same name. So this is kind of part one. Then the VPC resource itself, how the VPC resource was created, also kind of following Robin's tutorial, I added a resource with configure, and then I had to just add in the create method this part that is the main part that actually saying like, okay, so we're going to use our REST client that we've created in a provider, that now we're going to add all those configuration and perform the post request to our simulator. And from there, I'm just saving this code. And this is pretty straightforward, or maybe not straightforward, but pretty standard according to the Terraform provider building process. So this is just like the basic stuff of what the VPC, what can be done with VPC, but this is not the only thing, and it can be obviously extended into additional resources and all other stuff. So a couple of additional ideas. We can enforce formats and naming. For example, I can say that I want specific structure, I want specific letters, I want to have dash or not having dash, and kind of force the candidate into formats. So this is kind of making sure that he knows how to work when, let's say, security policies are preventing you from doing something. Outdated docs and deprecated configuration. This is a great example. Many times we're working with something that is progressing faster than the documentation, so you have to figure out or kind of brute force your way into the right configuration. Undocumented attribute. This is super common. I actually had it many times with boundary provider when I wanted to configure stuff, and there was just mentioning of the attribute, but no way to actually understand what should be configured there. Conflicting configurations is amazing. You can just say that something that is configured once can not be also leveraged by some other resource that has different configuration and kind of create a conflicts. So there's a lot of creativity here and dependencies error. So you can create a situation where there's not an implicit dependency that is required, but it still will not work without explicit dependency that you have to configure yourself. And this is also kind of a common thing that can happen when you're building an infrastructure and things actually dependent one on the other, but don't have the attributes to reference one on the other. So kind of going maybe one step back and asking what's wrong with using GenAI, because GenAI is a tool and we should probably all use it, and this will be part of the DevOps and platform engineer toolbox. The point is that there are goals of the interview. I want to validate the candidate skill. I want to validate candidate ability to handle the unknown, because this is what we have most of the time, right? There are things that are created daily, and the models are not updated that often, and we still have to figure out how to work with this. I want to see candidates' ability to learn and to think, because again, this is part of the job. And then I want candidate ability to leverage the right tools, and GenAI potentially is one of them, but it's not the only one. Now, the more interesting question is, can't GenAI still figure all of this thing? And the answer is, well, probably yes, but it's not straightforward, right? You probably need to build a right prompt. You need to find the right model that will be able to handle all of this context that you need to upload, including documentation and configuration and all of those. And if the candidate was able to do it, I probably want to hire him anyway. So I guess that's probably a good path forward. So just to summarize, right? When you try to build this, figure out what is important to you. What are you trying to test your candidate for? Kind of what is the scenario? Then translate this into technical problem, and then just alter the messaging or the terms, right? So instead of VPC, call it Terra Network. Instead of instance, call it Terra Compute or something like this. And GenAI is it's a tool. It's not a brain. But this is what happens in many cases with a lot of candidates, and this is what I'm trying to validate, that the candidates are actually using it as a tool and not as a replacement for their brain. So thanks a lot. If you have any questions, or you want to reach out, or you want me to share with you this code, or just the ideas, please feel free. This is my email. Find me on LinkedIn, shoot me an email. I'm available, and I'll be more than happy to talk about those things. So thanks a lot.